Despite being an industry worth hundreds of billions at the height of cultural relevancy, ask a fan of video games their thoughts on gaming and they'll talk of constant decline. It seems every day a new manifesto drops about why exactly games are dying, sometimes valid, sometimes conspiratorial and kinda weird. In large part, this frustration can quite easily be attributed to increased commercialization, sucking a lot of fun and whimsy out of the medium. Take open world games for instance. What once was a novelty that evoked a hitherto unknown sense of scale and bombast has become an industry standard synonymous with big, empty wastes of time. They took the coolest thing ever and made it suck. Not always, but as I hope to prove through this video, nothing's terrible in a vacuum. It's lazy implementation and half-baked integration that leaves the game feeling sloppy. The simple fact of the matter is that in a world where just developing a video game can be a multi-million dollar, multi-year spanning endeavor, it simply isn't enough to just sell well. Something needs franchise potential and a competitive spot in an ever-shifting attention economy. You can sell thousands of copies, but if you can't move merchandise and get an invested fandom doing 24/7 free advertising, then you may not have the motion to get your next project over the finish line. Most games don't even get the momentum to break even, let alone keep devs and artists around long term, with over 50% of all games published on Steam making less than $1,000, and a whopping 83% of mobile games completely failing within 3 years. This is despite mobile being one of the most lucrative platforms in general. Even when only looking at games priced $10 and above, which filters out a lot of hobbyist projects without publisher backing, the median revenue for a Steam game is $17,000, which isn't a lot when you consider just how long a process game development is. This shift in focus to maximize both transmedia profit of the IP and maximizing payouts from individual customers has led to some of the industry's most insidious practices, such as predatory microtransactions and game design optimized to maximize addiction and artificially extend runtimes rather than deliver a fun experience. Sometimes it really does feel like a race to the bottom between AAA execs' greediness and the desperate vying for attention indie devs have to subject themselves to. The message to aspiring creatives is clear. Learn how to pump out engagement slop or put on the McDonald's cap. One way in which games, particularly indie horror games, which is a space I operate within, carve out a niche in the transmedia attention economy is through what I'll be referring to as theory bait. This basically just applies to any kind of vaguely defined wider lore that hardly factors into the story and exists purely to facilitate an endless slew of content mill slop by channels like this one you're watching right now. That's right baby, I'm not above it. Without mindless slop, myself and quite literally everyone who does what I do would be out of a job. Whilst again, this writing process is not always strictly bad, it's when you create a culture of writing questions without answers that you establish a negative industry standard and universally lower the bar.
Cutting corners is just good business.
Hey, I'm Rat. Today I'm going to try and explain this phenomenon, its origins, the problems with it, and outline how we can, as a community, look to move past it. If at any point you find yourself enjoying, press subscribe, and if you don't, leave a nice comment telling me to kill myself or something. Thanks to my fantastic members who really just keep this whole thing going, and let's get on with it. A program from a 1968 Andy Warhol exhibition featured the now iconic quote, "In the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. That future is upon us, and I'd contend now the ultimate end goal for any public figure or product is to extend this 15 minutes for as long as possible by any means. Increasingly so, the best way to maintain relevancy in the 21st century is to navigate the attention economy, to curate a social media machine that will churn out content to keep users focused on you and only you, to make your branding a part of their daily doom scroll. Consumers are fickle and trends don't tend to last long, so you want to become utterly unavoidable and as annoying as possible for as long as you can. This is just as true for individuals as it is for products. The largest influencers and IPs around right now aren't only viewed through their own platforms, but rather through an extensive social media machine, a network of fan and, to be honest, also hate channels spreading every single content format. Think of your favorite game, and the odds are you spend more time consuming auxiliary content than actually playing it. Within the post-YouTube world of indie video games, this has been largely defined by a codependent relationship between content creators and game developers. When Let's Plays were first popping off on YouTube, the meta for horror games was to get a dude with a face cam to come scream at your monster.
Perfect! No! Stop screaming! Stop!
But indie horror content had its first major paradigm shift with the release of Scott Cawthon's Five Nights at Freddy's in 2014.
I find that hard to believe because, girl,
You
you
can
be
ask
like
her.
you like Five Nights at Freddy's.
What does that mean?
Whilst this title did get its fair share of the usual facecam jumpscare videos, it also saw itself at the centre of an emergent content format, being game theories.
Hello Internet and welcome to Game Theory, gaming's tangential learning experience. Through these videos, we hope you'll find more reasons to appreciate some of your favorite games, while sparking some interest in new real-world topics.
In 2011, YouTuber Matthew Patrick, known colloquially as MatPat, created the Game Theory channel. On this channel, he'd carve out a niche by creating video essays where he'd combine video game stories and mechanics with real-world science and philosophy to showcase different potential interpretations of the subject, whilst educating on scientific concepts. From its release in 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's would become a staple of MatPat's channel. Five Nights at Freddy's is a game with a lot of lore, which in the world of video games basically just means story that you aren't explicitly shown, but rather details about the world or events that a player has to actively seek out to shape their interpretation of the source material. It's optional set dressing that helps make the world feel more lived in and developed through implications. It's this lore that gives creators like MatPat a lot of ammunition for crafting their own unique theories and takes on the series. MatPat is, in many ways, a major pillar of FNAF's success. He's the first associated result when you Google Scott Cawthon, and he also cameoed in the 2023 FNAF movie. His videos on the topic have accrued tens of millions of views. However, MatPat is far from the only creator to foster an extensive back catalogue of FNAF video essays. FNAF has an immensely dedicated and passionate content creator ecosystem, from theorists to let's players to AU writers to fan game developers. Through its encapsulating lore and implicit mysteries, it reached a level of success practically unheard of for indie horror, and effectively created the playbook for the entire mascot horror subgenre. It also had far-reaching influence across the entire medium of gaming and set a standard that almost every single indie horror project that came after tried to adhere to. FNAF is, in the present day, a pop culture staple, not just some niche indie horror game.
I'd spend 5 nights at Freddy's just to show them how a real animatronic handles business.
The fanbase is kept glued to the series through a near endless content cycle, which paired with fairly frequent new releases, keeps all eyes fixed on FNAF. In the over decade since its release, FNAF has become a merchandising giant and transmedia powerhouse. This raises the question, is Five Nights at Freddy's the first example of theory-bait content curating a niche through fostering a community of online sleuths trying to uncover its mysteries? The answer is, kind of, it really depends. So let's talk in a bit more depth about it. So, we've established that Five Nights at Freddy's created a content niche wherein the game sustains relevancy through fostering a community of theorists and content creators, but we haven't really spoken about how this kills games. If anything, it actually sounds quite neat. Well, it can be, and there's a world of difference between a game with a well-crafted setting and lore and a theory-based game, so to explain the difference, let's take a look at an example of each. First, Five Nights at Freddy's, and second, Five Nights at Freddy's. The first 3 Five Nights at Freddy's games weren't planned from the start, although Scott has said that whilst working on the second installment, he already had a rough idea of what to do for the third. Ultimately, across the first 3 installments, there's a complete story told with minimal delineation from the ideas at the heart of the franchise. Even though these games weren't planned as a trilogy, tight focus and intentionality makes them work so well as a complete set. This trilogy of games has a strong thematic cohesion and central message that underpins the horror, being the benevolent face of evil. The first 3 Five Nights at Freddy's games use a combination of clues and minigames to tell a concise story about a purple guy using a beloved children's character to lure in kids to murder them. These children's souls then go on to possess animatronics, causing all kinds of issues for the company who owns said animatronics and their unwitting night staff. Eventually, in a dark bit of irony, the killer himself gets chased into and trapped inside of the very animatronic he used to lure in victims, possessing it and becoming a monster before eventually perishing in a fire at the end of the third game. Simple, to the point, with a poignant story about how not everything that wishes to harm you will evoke fear. Rather, sometimes the most evil beings wear the most friendly faces. In making the monsters victims of the very same fate you could potentially undergo, there's an underlying tragedy that adds so much complexity and depth to what would otherwise be a pretty one-note game. I use these games as an example of this kind of storytelling being good to emphasize that the issue isn't wanting to tell non-linear stories or having an emphasis on mystery. The issue is when these mysteries cease having answers, and the actual point of your narrative is obscured by this bizarre obsession with confusing and outwitting your audience. To give another example of this kind of writing being done well, to prove I'm not just some non-linear plot hater, let's look at every video essayist's favourite game, Dark Souls. Woo, yeah, woo. If you ask someone who's just beaten Dark Souls for the first time what the plot actually was, you'd get a response like, you sort of, you kind of... But when you actively seek out information on the story of Dark Souls, you aren't just hit with a bunch of auxiliary lore. Instead, item descriptions, environmental storytelling, optional dialogue, it all coalesces into this beautiful portrait that complements the game rather than existing alongside it. All the central themes of darkness and finding hope within are explored and iterated upon with every single boss, every NPC, every location. The central gameplay loop of dying and respawning is part of the story. Like Five Nights at Freddy's 1 through 3, seeking out additional lore doesn't hit you with some random side story, it actively enriches the experience. Everything is created in tandem, nothing feels tacked on, it's a holistic experience, just one with an abstract story structure. In an interview with YouTuber Dawko, Scott Cawthon himself said that he intended to finish the series with the third game. The only reason he kept going is because the jump scare wasn't very scary in the third one, so he needed to keep one-upping himself out of shame.
I think when I was making that game, in my mind, that was the end of a trilogy.
Yeah.
You know, I think in my mind, the story was going to be 3 games. And in all honesty, I think Five Nights at Freddy's 3 was where I kind of started letting myself be driven a little bit more by criticisms of the game than maybe I had before. Before, everybody was just really, really excited, you know, happy to have all this stuff. But whenever 3 came out, I really was starting to pay attention to criticism. You know, for instance, you know, even though I may have, you know, in some, you know, alternate life, may have left the series alone at 3, people were not happy with the jump scare, and it's kind of as simple as that. People weren't happy with the jump scare of Springtrap, and that really bothered me. And so then that kind of, in my mind, that wouldn't let the series rest in a way, because I wanted to make another entry that was really, really scary again.
This trilogy pretty neatly concludes the arc of the purple guy and the haunted animatronics with a clearly defined timeline and series of events that are easy to follow once you actually pay a bit of attention. However, Five Nights at Freddy's did not end with the third game, and as it continued it saw a marked shift away from a simple narrative told well to a bit of a jumble of ideas, retcons, and a constant escalation of stakes that saw it move away from a more grounded and eerie story to, honestly, absolute cartoon nonsense. The Five Nights at Freddy's community got so utterly lore-rotted at one point that they spent literal years trying to figure out what was in some random box. I don't think even Scott knew what was in this box.
What's in the box? What's in the fucking box?
If the original trilogy of games is the classic album The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, sleek, groundbreaking, to the point, then every subsequent game is Lauryn Hill's MTV Unplugged. It's kind of fun, full of good ideas, it's interesting in short bursts, but it's also just kind of all over the place and a bit weird. I still enjoy pretty much all of the post Five Nights at Freddy's 3 games to some extent. The character design remains amazing, the gameplay is fine-tuned and honestly a lot better most of the time, and the fan songs still bang, but it's undeniable that the slew of new characters and generally abstract direction of the series is no doubt born out of an idea to iterate upon the story forever without ever really deviating from the status quo. Rather than telling a compelling and complete story, the purpose is now to just keep adding new content to the world forever and ever, even if it actively undermines itself in doing so. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the character of William Afton, the purple guy I mentioned earlier. In the first 3 games, he's this mysterious and sadistic serial killer. Beyond this, he's a mad scientist, abusive father, fursona creator, corporate juggernaut, drunk driving aficionado. He's kind of everything. This information is not only revealed through minigames and clues, but also cringy supervillain dialogue and a frankly insane amount of extra material, like the many, many books on the subject.
What a deceptive calling. I knew it was a lie the moment I heard it, obviously, but it is intriguing nonetheless. Fascinating.
The characterization goes from creepy to being the most convoluted pile of sometimes contradictory traits ever. It feels like rather than being a fully realized character, Afton is more just whatever the plot needs him to be at best, and a barrage of traits made to generate content for AI-generated YouTube shorts at worst.
Did you know it was revealed in the Five Nights at Freddy's coloring book that William Afton's experiments into Remnant led to him pooping in a Springtrap suit? This led to the birth of Springtrap, the Stinky Winky animatronic. Follow me for more and buy my merch, please, 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 please.
The series develops this weird relationship with what is arguably its main character, throwing so much auxiliary content at him that now we have entire extensive deep dives into everything he does. Midnight Motorist is a minigame with the incredibly simple message that drunk driving is badass, and it has its own dedicated theorist community. William Afton, and by extension his family, have lost almost all of their intrigue and mystique through this bizarre need to just keep adding content even after we kind of don't need to anymore. However, when the series tried to move away from William Afton and do something new, then the obsession with adding lore and insecurity about saying anything too definitive was laid bare with Security Breach. Where the initial trilogy of games has a well-defined story that complements gameplay, the trilogy of Security Breach, Ruin, and Secret of the Mimic really highlights just how disjointed the story of Five Nights at Freddy's has become. The initial villain setup here is Vanny, a William Afton knockoff, but due to an extensive number of cuts detailed in this video by NotRealName NotAtAll, this character has almost no real presence in the game. They're a huge missed opportunity. The game flirts with a few other potential villains with its animatronics, particularly the daycare attendant and then Burntrap, who is kind of just William Afton again also. Then in Ruin, the game shifts focus to this new villain, the Mimic, who is also just kind of a William Afton ripoff, but they get a bit more backstory and fleshing out in Secret of the Mimic. So already this is just a load of new characters introduced and then dropped in favour of just throwing new content out every single release. But what makes it incredibly frustrating is that all of these characters appear to have been written in a vacuum with little to no consideration to what their game's wider themes actually are. Every character feels like they were designed with their own unique lore, YouTube short, and Funko Pop figure in mind before how they actually fit into the game was considered. When actually playing these games, every major character is cordoned off into their own themed segment with minimal overlap with anything else, almost like their entire essence has to be quarantined from the wider game. This habit of cordoning each character off as their own distinct set piece without much consideration for the wider implications, crossover, or their implementation and actual role in the story isn't unique or new to the FNAF games either. It's a mascot horror staple at this point. To explain this phenomenon, let's ask a question. What is the major defining character trait of all of the glam rock animatronics from Security Breach? Well, these characters aren't ghosts anymore, rather they're AI that was given such advanced programming that they basically are just sentient and self-aware creatures. However, they're simultaneously supposed to be characters to represent ideals and concepts. They have to be perfect. This leads to deep-rooted contradiction that emerges as instability across the band, particularly in Roxy's insecurity and Chica's ED. So naturally, the best villain to interplay with these characters and their themes is the Mimic, a being who can do everything they can do but better and perfectly embody any concept they need to. All of these characters have fear of being scrapped and replaced by another Endo who can do what they can do, and that's the Mimic's whole deal. The Mimic influencing all of these characters would help them grapple with their insecurities. The existence of the Mimic contrasts their almost human-like nature with a much more perfect machine. Through interplay with a more perfect and idealized caricature of themselves played by the Mimic, every character could contend with the conflict at the heart of their essence organically and through gameplay. Opening themselves up to possession allows these characters to indulge their worst vices and remove the humanity that defines them. The Mimic's ability to perfectly play any role means they could easily do everything the Glamrocks wish they could, but their more calculating robotic personality contrasts that self-awareness that makes the Glamrocks so endearing. But the Mimic isn't even from Security Breach's base game. They have almost no crossover with these characters who so perfectly contrast them. Instead, their perfect foil is deployed in a completely different game, and the villain in Security Breach is just this rabbit girl with almost no thematic crossover or even presence. It's pretty evident from Security Breach onwards that every single character, segment, and new installment is written without much consideration for the big picture. Rather, the focus is very much on just adding as much content as possible. This is also true of the clues sprinkled throughout the game. In the original releases, all of the clues told us more about the actual happenings of the game. In Secret of the Mimic, we get the backstory of the copyright to the chicken character, something that quite literally nobody has ever asked for. The focus isn't on the actual game and the immediate experience, but rather on just shoving as many ideas as possible in. When all you care about is feeding the content mills, then you abandon quality in favour of quantity, and it's just a jumble of ideas. The franchise loses a lot of its mystique and focus through this shift from providing a holistic experience to providing a literal endless stream of shiny new things and bold recontextualizations. In trying to maintain its space in the attention economy, FNAF has stopped being about anything and is instead just a generator that throws out a cool new robot for you to talk about the backstory of every few months. It feels more like a bunch of OCs cobbled together in a modular fashion than a real story with any actual point. However, whilst Five Nights at Freddy's was the first game to lean into this, it is far from the worst.
I love entering my neighbors' houses and being silly.
If Five Nights at Freddy's is the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, iconic, timeless, frankly a banger, then Hello Neighbor is one of those infamous Lauryn Hill shows where she doesn't show up on time and kind of phones it in. Okay, I'm gonna stop with the Lauryn Hill comparisons. I have no idea what I was thinking when I wrote this. Like, realistically, how big is the crossover of Mascot Horror fans and Fugees fans? This was stupid. This is so stupid. What am I doing with my life? Whilst Hello Neighbor started development before Five Nights at Freddy's, it released its first alpha build in 2016 after the first few Five Nights at Freddy's games had been released, and it followed the Mascot Horror playbook laid out to a T. They sent keys to as many YouTubers as possible and relentlessly tweeted at MatPat with every update to try and get that big, juicy, voluptuous game theory exposure. Yeah, baby, yeah. While it can be debated that Five Nights at Freddy's was killed by its obsession with lore and adding story details, the games are still pretty popular and pretty good, to be honest, outside of the story kind of being all over the place. There's a little debate to be had about Hello Neighbor. It's pretty evident what happened here. The initial selling point of Hello Neighbor was the neighbor's AI. It was a fun game where you got chased around by an enemy who, despite quite a lot of bugs, was responsive to the player's actions and would try to outsmart you in this cat and mouse chase. The fun of the game, the thing people enjoyed, was the neighbor. The chases, the tension of being in a house where this intelligent AI was trying to track you down. However, with each new release, the neighbor was dropped in favour of making the house bigger, adding more stuff, more content. Exploration around the house was expanded, but the neighbor wasn't even present within most of these new zones, shifting from a real active threat to an occasional irritant. Within the full release, there were several levels with minimal implementation of the neighbor, and the grand finale, Act 4, is a giant empty parkour segment wherein the neighbor himself is not an active or present threat, but rather set dressing. Beyond the first act, and especially in the finale, the game's obsession with this self-indulgent abstract storytelling full of cryptic hints and devoid of any real substance actively hinders its ability to be a tense or interesting horror game. Full levels are dedicated not to player engagement or curating a fun experience, but rather to crafting lore. In following the Five Nights at Freddy's playbook to the letter, Hello Neighbor surpassed it in the department of actively sidelining its ability to be an actual video game in favour of creating an endless content mill. Despite a not insignificant amount of negative critical response and some pushback, Hello Neighbor succeeded in its aim of creating a mascot horror with franchise potential. Publisher TinyBuild immediately set about marketing the hell out of this game, releasing books that made upwards of $16 million in revenue, as well as spin-off games, including a Stadia-exclusive racing game for whatever reason. Around this time, TinyBuild CEO Alex Nichaporchik basically stated my initial thesis from the introduction to this video, saying, "Indie publishing stopped being a sustainable business model the minute the number of mid-sized publishers exceeded the number of good games being developed. Instead of focusing on one-off publishing deals, it's better to build strong and entertaining brands. That means large in-house development infrastructure that can support both internal games and external studios." One way in which TinyBuild kept the marketability of the Neighbor brand was through endless lore, with the story being expanded infinitely through books, spin-offs, and eventually a full-blown sequel. I think there might be a third game coming out as well. Maybe, I don't know. I don't really care. It's worth noting here that the initial mystery of Hello Neighbor was, what is my weird neighbor keeping in his basement? It could quite literally be anything. It could be Pokemon cards, it could be a copy of The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. But now the series has extensive ARG rollouts to promote new games, and ghosts and ancient secret cults are part of the story. It's just so much stuff added not to tell an engaging story, but rather to extend the 15-minute fame of the IP for as long as possible. These mysteries are not written to be solved, they're not written with answers in mind. Simple questions are convoluted and abstracted ad nauseum, all with the focus of generating endless content so that you can sell more books, plushies, cartoons, and spin-off racing games. What concrete information and answers do exist are transient, subject to change at any time should they no longer facilitate the goal of keeping the story moving, irrespective of how interesting it actually is. This is what I meant in the introduction when I said the industry standard being established is a culture of writing questions but no answers. The intention is to outsource the writing to the community, to let them bicker and theorize forever, not out of a desire to craft an intriguing mystery, but rather to create a free marketing team. It's so cynical, and it robs your most invested fans of closure and genuine engaging storytelling. This is a very bad standard to set. Eventually, people are going to get bored of being provided nothing but endless clues and no answers. You can't extend a mystery forever. If nothing's ever allowed to end, then what's even the point of writing stories for games? If we aren't going to try and tell complete stories, then what are we writing for? We're just sort of adding details to try and create worlds that are just as fleshed out and convoluted as our own. Nobody likes the world we live in. That's why people play video games, you know? Like, there should be a story, like an actual story you can follow. It should be able to tell you something, right? It should have a point. No? But Hello Neighbor isn't even the worst example of this very cynical lore without story direction, so let's take a look at the gold standard of slop. Garten of Banban is the most cynical application of the Five Nights at Freddy's inspired mascot horror playbook I've ever seen. It plays into all of the most generic and trite tropes of the genre to farm money from a largely juvenile audience, or I guess their parents. This game exists entirely to vomit out more characters that can be added into iPad Baby Elsagate type content and sold as marketable plushies. Even more so than contemporaries like Poppy's Playtime, which at least attempt to try and attach some interesting ideas and fun gameplay mechanics to their plushie commercials, this is just bad. It's brain rot in its purest form. Garten of Banban was developed by the Euphoric brothers, who robbed us of their potential magnum opus Poopoo Monster in favour of releasing this. Prior to Garten of Banban, they tried to make more serious and conventional horror to minimal fanfare and mild controversy, which I don't have time to cover, before fully leaning into the mascot horror money machine. Garten of Banban is a game full of and absolutely no real substance, a 10 or so minute mid-fest. The sequels aren't much better. It's basically a slapdash proof of concept to try and launch the IP as fast as possible, with the first game featuring a real world merch store and a link to wishlist the second installment before work had even begun on it. The story wasn't written to actually say anything, rather to facilitate the content mill, to keep the attention economy locked in on their brand. Each new chapter is a hastily constructed asset flip with only a handful of original things, mainly the marketable characters because, you know, we gotta move these t-shirts, bro. We gotta sell these plushies. It's all the worst parts of this approach laid bare, and even with this little effort it succeeded because the industry standard has been set, the bar's in hell. Garten of Banban is so extremely substanceless that even other mascot horror creators turned on it, with the creator of Bendy and the Ink Machine releasing a parody making fun of the game called Meatly's Storage World. However, none of this matters because Garten of Banban isn't the issue. It's symptomatic of the culture we have created, of the industry standards that have been allowed to happen. Garten of Banban is kiddie slop for iPad babies. It's nothing too exceptional or out of the ordinary. I don't highlight it to say this franchise has the hidden potential to be some A24 elevated horror with a change of direction. The game wasn't killed, it was dead on arrival, and I'm far from the target audience. Like, you can disagree with me here, this just isn't for me. I'm not highlighting it to say, oh, this is a game that was killed by lore. I'm highlighting to ask, why is this one of the most prominent faces in horror across all demographics? It's fine to have sanitized PG-rated horror for kids. It's bad that this is pretty much the only horror to get exposure in the space because it leans the hardest into this lore-first writing. I adored the children's horror movie Monster House, but if every horror movie was Monster House, then I'd probably hate it. I'd hate it even more if instead of just letting me watch the story, it demanded I purchase another movie to get 1/5 of Chowder's ominous backstory.
It's time for an in-your-face disgrace!
It's terrible that this absolute YouTube Shorts core game is representative of an industry standard spanning almost all well-known indie games. I appreciate this game existing because it really does strip back all the pretense and lay bare exactly how little care or attention to detail or planning needs to go into a series for it to be picked up. It's the perfect example of what I'm talking about. This game has every right to exist, but it takes up so much space in the lane of indie horror that I can't help but despise it. Were it the exception and not the rule, it wouldn't be a problem, but that simply isn't the case. Garden of Banban is everything I hate about the current state of indie games and what developers need to do to get any kind of status. It feels like every aspect was run through 16 AIs and 7 focus groups to maximize marketability and engagement. The abstract and vague storyline is just one facet of this. It's soulless, utterly devoid of any meaning or purpose. The story was written entirely to generate faux intrigue, until around halfway through the series when they just gave up and made everything a joke. It has nothing to say and nothing interesting or redeeming to it. All that matters is a response big enough to keep the cash flow going. Absolutely nothing else is even considered. I can keep listing these effortless games designed entirely to create a never-ending number of theory videos, but I think by now I should have made my point and I want to pivot into something a bit more hopeful. Let's stop talking about examples and go back to the big picture. Lore is killing games, but why and how can we change this?
There may be times when you purchase something of questionable quality.
All of these examples are great, but they only paint a small picture of the wider whole. Frankly, the indie landscape is becoming so incredibly oversaturated with this utter slop because it sells well. It dominates the attention economy, it gets big views on YouTube and fosters huge audiences because it's not a one and done story, but rather something you can build an entire content farm around. As we saw in the Hello Neighbor section, these studios are well aware of this. The idea isn't to create art or interactive experiences, it's to bleed the customers dry and fry their dopamine with endless shiny new content. Keep the brand going at all costs. But this is a problem because if we just have these infinite stories designed to never end or relinquish their hold on the audience, then there's no room to tell completed stories. No room to allow for a creator to explore a total narrative, to allow their fans closure and catharsis. Every game story is written not to be an encapsulation of a single core essence, but rather to be everything at all times for every possible audience, and that just makes everything so bland and samey. It means that every game just stretches on forever into this beige abyss. Without moving on and leaving space for new creations, we're left with the shambling carcasses of once giants wearing a bright new dress every week as they're carted out to the street corner by the corporate overlords. Honestly, there's a lost beauty in art in actually just ending something instead of letting it fade away as it thrashes around and pathetically begs for your attention with every dying breath. But I want to be hopeful and say this is not to say that the indie horror space is devoid of any fresh ideas or fun concepts. Whilst algorithms and exposure are heavily skewed in the direction of bottom of the barrel theory bait, there's a whole world of aspiring creatives who actually care, who actually want to tell stories and push the boundaries of the medium, who consider gaming to be an art form, something that people should care about rather than just the infinite money glitch. Here's a list of interesting lesser-known horror games with complete stories, because developers who actually put in time and effort and want to say something do deserve to be celebrated. Parasocial, a game where you play as a VTuber trying to evade a deranged chatter. I have a video about this one. Without a Dawn, a beautiful ASCII psychological horror where you try and escape your own intrusive thoughts out in the wilderness, a phenomenal narrative with a super unique art style and lots of room for analysis. Ad Infinitum, a World War I psychological horror where you try and grapple with the horrific manifestations of your own failings as a young, arrogant German commander hired through nepotism rather than merit. It's one of those you are the bad guy games. How Fish is Made, a surrealist horror with the gameplay of Katamari Damacy, one for the real weirdos out there to be honest. The Strange Men Anthology, classic jumpscare heavy RPG maker horror with some alternate paths that encourage player choice, great popcorn horror to play with some friends, and a pretty sizable community you can share your theories and takes with. Fear the Spotlight, a PSX-style sapphic survival horror game about all aspects of forbidden and unrequited love, both wholesome and horrifying, great for Silent Hill fans and lesbians alike, although the Venn diagram there is basically a circle. The Boba Tea Shop, a cozy shop simulator with a ghostly horror narrative that runs parallel, great for people who enjoy both relaxing games and horror. What Remains of Edith Finch, a surrealist musing on familial trauma, one for psychology enjoyers. This one's 2 games, both Frambo and Little Misfortune. They're Tim Burton-esque storybook point-and-click adventures with hugely disturbing implicit lore, but a complete narrative that complements it and a splash of dark humour. Now, these are just some of my favourites, but my call to action here is talk about and celebrate your favourite indies. Gaming isn't dying, it's just heavily skewed in favour of half-baked dog shit because that's what generates the content. When you go and look at the genuinely interesting indies that get a big push and foster fan bases, word of mouth is what pushes it. Creators taking the time to sit down and talk about them is what drew eyes to successful indie games like Mouthwashing, Fear and Hunger, Iron Lung, games that actually do have something to say, develop story and obvious passion. Only through actively pushing for legitimately good art does the industry shift to legitimize it. It requires concerted effort and pressure from the consumer base to banish the industry's worst practices, because there's no motivation to do it if there isn't a consumer pushback. This isn't some stupid run up my comment section call to action either. I don't care if you want to share your favorites in my comments. I'm telling you to make your own YouTube video. Put your favorite creators onto those hidden gems. Go live right now, even if you've just got an audience of 2 people and a dog, and just show a bit of love to those creatives who go against the financial incentive to produce crap and actually make something with care. I know for a fact that even the tiniest bit of exposure could mean the world to some of these passionate unknown creatives, and you can be the person to do that for them. I get a lot of comments from people asking me to cover their favourite game, and whilst I always love to get suggestions and I'm always down to check out new things, my advice is always the same here. I'm not going to match your passion or energy for your favourite thing. If you feel so strongly about something, then you should be the one to talk about it. You're a human being with passions and interests. If something genuinely makes you feel something, then share that feeling. The purpose of art is to evoke responses, not to lull you to sleep with predictable, endless AI-adjacent garbage. An implicit benefit of all these social media platforms and user-generated media is that it should democratize art. It should allow sufficiently dedicated and passionate creatives to find and foster communities. However, increasingly so, we allowed the corporatized stain of old media to infect the space through insipid algorithms, rather than pushing back against it and demanding better. The worst practices exist purely because there is incentive to engage in them. By granting confidence and instilling motivation within these aspirant developers beginning their journeys, we can see more of them actively pursue their dream projects. We get more good art. Look at the Euphoric brothers who made Garten of Banban. They were trying before they saw that they could just give up. The solution isn't to endlessly deride and put down devs who engage in these practices. It's fun and all, but it's little more than rage bait and engagement farming of a different kind. The solution is to uplift truly talented and creative creators. If you feel like there should be a space in any art to promote what you care about and you can't find one, then make one yourself. This happens in music, it happens in traditional art, it should happen in gaming. So no, law doesn't kill games, rather it's a carrion bird pecking at the twitching carcass of the medium. As with all of the worst aspects of the industry, it's a symptom of greed and laziness, and the only cure is to use your voice, however quiet, to demand better. This is not the fault of any set developer or team. I doubt anyone working in the industry wants to make a bad game. This isn't some grand conspiracy. It's the fault of a shared culture wherein we don't uplift our successes and incessantly whine about our failings instead of providing constructive and legitimate, legible analysis. There needs to be less incentive for the bare minimum and more incentive to try. So yeah, I've been Rat, and I'm leaving you with the homework to go and glaze that hidden gem you've had in the Steam library for the last few years, to finish that dream project, to be a positive force within the art and the community, to demand better and celebrate when we do better. Gaming isn't dead yet, and the only thing that can kill it or save it is both you and me. Hey, quick epilogue here. Whilst working on this video, I did some looking into Ross Scott's Stop Killing Games movement, which is a brilliant consumer-driven initiative that effectively seeks to prevent planned obsolescence in the gaming industry, instead suggesting we put power into the hands of fans when a game is no longer supported by its developers. Instead of games basically dying and becoming lost media, fans can pick them up, run servers, just keep the art alive. As someone who spent a lot of money on Destiny 2 content that literally doesn't exist anymore, it caught my attention quite a lot, to be honest. It has a lot of overlap with what I'm saying here about wanting a more invested and active consumer base. You want to take ownership of the medium, if you care, you should be celebrated. Communities have a lot more power. Just check it out, do your own reading. But yeah, I mean, it's good. In the description there's a link to read more and sign the petition, alongside links to all the horror games I mentioned, as well as the YouTubers shouted out here. I've also included a list of YouTubers who cover horror games with less than 6-figure audiences. They can just help keep you clued in on what's going on in the indie horror space. Hopefully you can get some recommendations, hear some alternate takes, just get invested in the space, because you can't only hear from me. I upload like once a year at this point. So yeah, if you want some recommendations, then check them out. These are all guys that I watch, and they generally have pretty good takes, and they can give you some recommendations. Yeah, much love to the community. As always, thank you to the members. This is just my rambly bit. So yeah, see you around.